Hello and welcome. Tonight, we are opening 15 quiet stories from people who are awake when something strange passed close by. None of these encounters began with noise or panic. There were no crowds waiting with cameras, no alarms, no warning. For now, find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders loosen. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow the noise of the day to fall away. And if you enjoy these quiet encounters, you can like the video and subscribe, so you do not miss the stories still waiting here tomorrow night. Chapter 1. The Voice at the Window. At 3:12 in the morning, Ethan woke because someone had said his name. The voice came from outside his bedroom window. It was not loud. It was not whispered. There was no strain in it, no anger, and no urgency. It sounded like an ordinary person speaking from only a few feet away, close enough to expect an answer. Ethan sat upright before he was fully awake. For several seconds, he did not move. He listened for the sound of shoes on wet ground, a hand touching the glass, or a second voice farther back in the garden. Nothing followed. Complete silence. Ethan lived in a small, rented house just beyond the edge of a village. It was the kind of place that became very quiet after dark. The last row of streetlights ended some distance away, and the houses grew farther apart until the road gave way to fields. His bedroom was on the ground floor at the rear of the house. Beyond the window was a narrow back garden, then a low fence, and after that open land. There was no street behind the property, no public path, no reason for anyone to be standing outside his window at that hour. He looked toward the clock beside the bed. 3:12 a.m. The room was dark enough that the shapes of the furniture had almost disappeared. A faint strip of gray light came through the curtains, but it did little more than mark where the window was. Ethan waited. His heart was beating harder now, though he kept telling himself that he had probably been dreaming. People sometimes woke while carrying part of a dream into the room with them. A word, a sound, the feeling that someone else was nearby. Then something brushed across the outside wall. It lasted perhaps 1 second. A soft, dragging sound moved along the brick beside the window, like a piece of fabric being pulled gently across the rough surface. It was too light to sound like an animal scratching, too controlled to be a branch, and there were no bushes growing close enough to touch the house. The sound stopped as quickly as it had begun. Ethan moved his feet onto the floor. He did not switch on the bedside lamp. He could not have explained why. Perhaps he did not want anyone outside to know exactly where he was. Perhaps some older part of his mind had already decided that darkness was safer. He crossed the room and reached for the curtain. The fabric felt cold beneath his fingers. He opened a narrow gap and looked outside. The garden appeared empty. The grass was dark and damp after rain earlier that evening. The fence stood undisturbed at the far end. Beyond it, the field stretched into darkness, with no lights moving across them and no figure standing near the boundary. Ethan checked the space directly below the window, then looked toward the shed and along both sides of the garden. Nothing. For a moment, embarrassment replaced fear. He felt foolish standing in the dark, staring into an empty yard because of a voice that may never have existed. He began to close the curtain. That was when he noticed a darker area in the grass beneath the window. At first, it looked like a shadow cast by the house. As his eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. It was an oval. The grass had been pressed flat in a smooth, clean form directly below the window. The area was about the size of a small table, perhaps slightly larger. Its edges were easy to follow, even in the weak light. because the grass outside the shape remained upright. Inside it, every blade leaned in the same direction. Nothing moved in the garden. There was no sign of whatever had made the mark. Ethan stayed behind the curtain for another minute, watching the oval and the empty land beyond it. He considered opening the window and calling out, but the thought felt wrong. He also considered going outside immediately. He did neither. He returned to bed, though he did not sleep again. Each small sound from the house seemed sharper than it had before. Pipes settling in the walls, the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room, rainwater slipping from the gutter and striking the ground. But the voice did not return. By daylight, the garden looked less threatening. The fields were pale beneath a low morning sky, and the ordinary sounds of the village had begun again. In the distance, the oval was still there. Ethan went outside, wearing his shoes and a jacket. The flattened area was even clearer than it had seemed through the window. Its outline was smooth rather than broken, with no random patches extending beyond it. The grass was bent, but not torn. The soil underneath showed no deep impression. Nothing suggested that a heavy object had fallen there. There were no prints around the edge, no marks in the wet earth, and no path through the grass leading from the fence. Whatever had pressed it down appeared to have arrived without crossing the garden. Ethan crouched beside the shape. He reached out and placed his palm against the flattened grass. It felt colder than the grass around it. The difference was not dramatic. It did not feel frozen, and there was no frost on the blades. But when he moved his hand from the oval to the upright grass beside it, the change was clear enough to notice. He tested it again. Cold inside, warmer outside. Ethan tried to find a simple answer. A large animal might have lain there, though an animal would have disturbed the grass unevenly and left tracks in the wet ground. A heavy object could have made the shape, but nothing of that size could have been carried into the garden without leaving some trace. Wind did not explain the clean boundary. Rain did not explain the colder grass, and neither explained the voice. By late afternoon, the oval had already begun to disappear. The grass slowly lifted as it dried, and the edges became harder to see. By evening, most of the blades were upright again. The garden had returned to normal, almost completely. Ethan was left with only the memory of a calm voice speaking his name through the glass, the brief sound of something brushing against the wall, and a shape in the grass that lasted just long enough for daylight to confirm it had been there. Something had stood outside his window. It had remained there long enough to leave a mark. Then it had gone without a sound he could follow. Chapter 2. The lights that went out one by one. Kieran's night shift was built around repetition. Every hour, he left the small security office and walked the perimeter of the distribution warehouse. He checked the loading bays, the locked side doors, and the wide car park stretching away from the building. Most nights, nothing changed between one round and the next. Just after 2 in the morning, the air was cold and still. The warehouse stood outside town, separated from the nearest buildings by open ground and access roads that were almost empty at night. It was a long, rectangular structure with a row of loading docks along one side. Tall lamps had been placed at even distances across the car park, creating separate pools of white light on the asphalt. Low cloud covered the sky. There was no wind. Kieran had reached the far corner of the building when the most distant lamp flickered. It happened only once. The light weakened slightly afterward, but it did not go out. Kieran looked at it for a moment, decided the bulb was beginning to fail, and continued walking. Then the next lamp dimmed. It was closer to him than the first. A single flicker, a drop in brightness, then stillness. Kieran stopped. The two lamps now gave off the same dull light, while every other lamp in the row remained normal. He watched them, waiting for the familiar stutter of a bad electrical connection. Instead, the third lamp flickered. Then it faded to match the others. The change was moving along the car park, one light at a time. There was a short pause between each one, almost equal in length. The sequence began at the far end of the property and advanced steadily toward the place where Kieran stood. Flicker, dim, pause, then the next. There was no buzzing from the lamps, no popping sound, no flash from the building's power system. The warehouse behind him continued running as usual, its refrigeration units and ventilation equipment producing the same distant mechanical hum. Only the lights were changing. Kieran stepped backward. He did it slowly, without taking his eyes from the row. A strange instinct made him control his breathing, as though whatever was moving toward him might react if he made too much noise. Another lamp dimmed, then another. The darker section of the car park grew longer. Each new change brought the edge of it closer. Soon, only two lamps remained at full brightness. One stood between Kieran and the dimmed row. The other was directly above him. The first one flickered and weakened. Now the entire car park behind him had fallen to the same low brightness. Only the lamp over his head remained unchanged. Kieran looked up. At first he saw nothing except the flat gray surface of the cloud cover. Then he noticed a pale glow above the warehouse roof. It was faint and spread across a broad area with no clear edge. It did not resemble a spotlight shining upward from the ground. There was no beam beneath it and no bright center. The clouds continued to drift slowly. The glow stayed where it was. Its position made it difficult to judge its size. It seemed wide and flat, resting somewhere inside or above the low cloud, but the shape could not be followed with certainty. The longer Kieran looked, the less sure he became of where it began and ended. A sound reached him from overhead, not an engine, not the deep rumble of an aircraft. It was a low, restrained hum, almost electrical in quality, so quiet that he first wondered whether he was hearing equipment inside the warehouse. But the sound seemed to come from the sky, and it grew slightly stronger as the pale light moved over the building. The air changed with it. Kieran felt a small amount of pressure inside his ears. They popped once, as they might during a change in altitude. At the same time, the space around him seemed heavier, like the air before a storm, though the clouds gave no sign of rain. He swallowed and tried to clear his ears. The pressure remained. The pale glow was now almost directly above him. The lamp over his head flickered twice. Kieran looked down instinctively as its brightness dropped. The final pool of strong light disappeared from the car park. He was not left in darkness. Every lamp remained on, but all of them now produced the same weak glow. The warehouse walls looked flatter. The loading bays had lost their sharp shadows. The far end of the lot seemed farther away than it had moments before. The hum reached its highest point. Then everything stopped. The sound ended so cleanly that Kieran could not tell whether it had faded or been cut off. The pressure in his ears released at the same moment. When he raised his eyes, the pale glow was gone. The clouds above the warehouse looked ordinary again. For a few seconds, none of the lamps changed. Then the farthest one brightened. It returned to full strength without flickering. A moment later, the next lamp in the row did the same. The sequence was reversing. Light after light recovered, but this time the change moved away from Kieran. The lamp above him remained dim while the others grew brighter in order. carrying the line of normal light toward the far edge of the property. The last distant lamp returned. Finally, the one over his head brightened. The car park looked exactly as it had before. Kieran stayed where he was for several moments. He could hear the warehouse machinery again, along with the distant sound of a vehicle somewhere beyond the property. Nothing in the night suggested that an entire row of lamps had just responded to something moving above them. He completed the rest of the perimeter check quickly and returned to the security office. Inside, he opened the electrical monitoring panel. The system displayed no warning messages. No lamps were listed as faulty. There had been no interruption to the warehouse supply, and no voltage event recorded during the previous hour. He checked the log twice. According to the building, every light had remained steady. Kieran considered whether the cloud glow might have come from an aircraft, but an aircraft would have moved with a clear direction, and its sound would not have caused the lamps below it to dim in a perfect sequence. A power problem might have affected the row. It would not have traveled toward him one lamp at a time, paused overhead, and then moved away in reverse. What remained with him was not simply the glow or the quiet hum. It was the order. Something had crossed the warehouse lot along a straight path. The lights beneath it had weakened, one after another, as though marking its position. Marviad, the pressure had arrived as it passed over him, and vanished when it moved on. Nothing was damaged, nothing was missing. The warehouse records showed no event at all. Yet Kieran had stood beneath the final lamp and watched the darkness approach him, one measured step at a time. Chapter 3. The Light That Entered the Sea. Darren had fished the same stretch of coast, often enough to know it belonged there. He knew the shape of the rocks beneath low tide. He knew how the wind changed before sunrise, and how distant boats usually announced themselves, even when their hulls could not yet be seen. On clear mornings, small lights appeared far out on the water and shifted slowly against the horizon. This one did not. It was the fourth morning of that week when he first paid attention to it. Darren had arrived shortly before 5, carrying his rods and a small bag of gear down the narrow strip of sand. The beach was only a few minutes across, enclosed by dark rock on both sides. Not far from shore, the seabed dropped sharply into deeper water. The sky was still black, though a faint gray line had started to form in the east. Low above the horizon, a white light held over the sea. There was a slight yellow tone inside it, not enough to make it look orange and not warm like a harbor lamp. It was simply a steady point, brighter than the stars that remained visible, and lower than any star should have been. Darren assumed it was a fishing boat. He set down his bag, assembled his rod, and glanced back toward the water. The light had not moved. There was no red or green navigation lamp beside it, no smaller deck lights, no reflection stretching across the surface. He watched for several minutes before returning to his line. By the time the sky had begun to brighten, the light had weakened and disappeared. That alone did not seem worth remembering. The next morning, it was there again. Same place, same height, same pale color. Darren stood on the wet sand with his gear still over one shoulder, looking first at the light and then along the coastline. There were no vessels close to shore. The water was dark and open, with no fixed structure that could carry a lamp. Once again, the point remained steady until the growing daylight swallowed it. On the third morning, Darren arrived earlier. He wanted to see whether the light appeared at a certain time, or whether it was already waiting before he reached the shore. The beach was darker than usual when he walked down, and the tide made a slow pulling sound against the stones. The light was already there. He checked his phone. 4:52 a.m. Darren kept it in his hand and watched for movement. A minute passed. 4:53. Nothing changed. Without another object nearby, its distance was impossible to judge. It might have been a small lamp far offshore, or something larger hanging much closer. There was no beam beneath it, and no visible outline surrounding it, only a single point above the water. As dawn approached, it faded exactly as it had before. By the fourth morning, Darren was no longer coming only to fish. He reached the shore around 4:45, while the coastline was still hidden in deep blue darkness. The light occupied its usual position near the horizon. The air felt cold but not harsh. A weak breeze moved across the water, and small waves broke against the sand in uneven rows. Then the background noise began to change. The sea did not become fully silent. Water still reached the shore, and the breeze remained against his jacket. Yet every sound seemed reduced, as though heard through a closed window. The waves were quieter. The wind carried less movement. Even the scrape of his boot against the stone sounded distant. Darren stopped unpacking. The light remained motionless for another few seconds. Then it began to descend. There was no sudden drop and no sideways turn. It moved straight downward at a slow, even rate, holding the same white-yellow brightness as it came closer to the surface. Darren stepped toward the water. He expected the movement to reveal the shape of a vessel beneath it. He expected a reflection to form, or the light to brighten against the sea. Neither happened. The point lowered through the darkness until it reached the surface and continued. No splash, no ripple. The light passed into the water without disturbing it at all. For a brief moment, it was visible beneath the surface. Its glow seemed unchanged, neither scattered nor softened by the sea. Then it sank farther and disappeared into the dark below. Darren stood at the edge of the incoming tide. He watched the place where it had gone in. Nothing moved there except the ordinary rise and fall of the water. There was no widening circle, no bubbles, and no reflected glow from below. The surface had accepted it without response. Darren walked along the shoreline, trying to change his viewing angle. He searched for the wake of a submerged vessel or any shape moving under the water. There was nothing to follow. The sea looked exactly the same from every position. He did not cast a line that morning. Instead, he remained near the shore until the sky had fully brightened. A few distant boats became visible later, each one easy to recognize by its movement and the small collection of lights around it. None occupied the place where the pale point had been. Darren returned home with his equipment still packed. He considered staying away the following morning. A part of him wanted to let the event become uncertain with time, something that might later be explained as poor distance judgment in the dark. But before 5 the next day, he was back on the same beach. The light hovered in its usual place. It had the same brightness, the same pale yellow center. It seemed not to have changed by even a small amount. Darren did not walk as close to the water this time. He remained higher on the sand and watched. After several minutes, the light began its descent again, straight down, slow and steady. As it neared the surface, Darren found himself moving backward. He had stepped forward the first time, drawn by the need to understand what he was seeing. Now his body made the opposite choice before he had decided anything. The light touched the sea. It passed through. Again, there was no splash and no ripple, no evidence that the boundary between air and water had mattered. Then it was gone. Darren never found a boat schedule, marker, or shore-based light that matched what he had seen. He could explain the steady position only by assuming something fixed far beyond the horizon, but that did not explain the descent. A flare would drift and fade, an aircraft would cross the sky, a vessel entering deeper water would disturb the surface. Oh, this light did none of those things. What stayed with Darren was the ease of it. The object did not strike the water or break through it. It entered without resistance, as if the sea were not truly present for whatever was moving there. Or perhaps it was moving through something else entirely. Darren had only seen the brief moment when its path crossed his own world, just before the light disappeared beneath the dark surface and left the ocean unchanged. Chapter 4, 12 degrees on the desert highway. The temperature display changed before Aaron saw anything ahead. He was driving south through the Nevada desert, returning from a job near Tonopah, sometime around 1 in the morning. The highway ran almost perfectly straight, a dark strip of asphalt between flat stretches of sand and low scrub. There had been no other cars for some time. Warm air entered through the partly open window. The dashboard showed 27 degrees Celsius, which felt normal for the dry night outside. Then the number dropped to 23. Aaron glanced at it, but kept driving. A sensor could hesitate or correct itself after a long stretch at the same reading. He had seen small changes before. A few seconds later, it showed 19. The air against his face felt cooler now, not imagined. Not just a number changing inside the car. The warmth leaving the cabin was clear enough that he raised the window slightly, then stopped with his hand still on the switch. The display continued falling, 17, 14, then 12 degrees Celsius. It stayed there. Aaron looked into the darkness on both sides of the road. There were no hills close enough to create a sudden pocket of colder air, no visible storm, no change in elevation that would explain a drop of 15 degrees within less than a minute. The desert beyond the headlights remained empty. Farther ahead, a small group of white lights appeared low over the highway. At first, Aaron took them for another vehicle approaching from a distance. There seemed to be 5 or 6 points, arranged close together, their brightness softened by the dark air between them and the road. He waited for them to separate into headlights. They did not. The lights were not coming toward him. They were holding in one place, only a short distance above the asphalt. Aaron eased off the accelerator. As the truck moved closer, the cluster became easier to see. Each point gave off a dull, white glow. Some were slightly brighter than others, but none flashed or changed color. They cast no visible light onto the road. That detail bothered him first. Headlights would have painted the asphalt ahead of them. Even a weak lamp should have created a pale reflection on the lane markings or the dusty shoulder. These lights appeared bright enough to see clearly, yet the ground beneath them remained black. Aaron slowed to a crawl. The temperature still read 12 degrees. He checked the windshield for reflections from his own dashboard. He shifted his head from side to side and covered part of the instrument panel with one hand. The point stayed in the same position. They were outside. No building stood nearby. No signpost or tower rose from the sand. The road continued straight through open land, with nothing tall enough to hold a cluster of lamps at that height. The cool air pressed through the narrow gap in the window. Aaron considered stopping completely, but something about the stillness ahead made him keep the vehicle moving. He wanted to understand what he was approaching without becoming fixed in place beneath it. At roughly 50 yards, one of the lights began to rise. It did not leap upward or flicker. It shifted slowly, as if being lifted through something thick and invisible. A second light followed. Then the rest moved together. The entire cluster climbed in the same measured way until it hovered perhaps 10 or 15 feet above the road. The spacing between the lights did not change. They remained arranged as one group, though Aaron could see no body or frame connecting them. The road below stayed dark. For one brief moment, the lights held there. Aaron's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He listened for a motor, rotor blades, or even the soft electrical buzz that some roadside equipment produced. There was no sound beyond the low engine of his own vehicle. The lights did not drift with the air. They did not sway or separate. They simply waited. Then every point shot straight upward. The movement was so fast that Aaron could not follow it. There was no visible acceleration, no gradual climb, and no curve away from the road. One moment, the lights were suspended above the asphalt. The next, the sky was empty. No trail remained behind them. They did not shrink into the distance or weaken as they rose. They vanished, as if the space they occupied had been cleared. In a single instant, Aaron brought the truck to a stop. The highway ahead was open again. His headlights reached over the same lane where the cluster had hovered, revealing only cracked asphalt, faded paint, and sand gathered along the edge. Nothing stood on the road. Nothing moved in the sky. The dashboard display changed, 13 degrees, then 15. Aaron lowered the window farther. The air was warming almost as quickly as it had cooled. 18 degrees, 21. The return happened steadily over the next minute. By the time the temperature reached 27 again, the desert air felt exactly as it had before. The lights appeared. Aaron remained stopped for a while, looking through the windshield. A faulty sensor might explain numbers moving across a screen. It could not explain the cold air entering through the window. Headlight reflections might form points of light on glass. Reflections did not hover above the road, rise together, and disappear vertically. He drove forward at last. When he reached the place where the lights had been, there were no marks on the asphalt and no objects beside the road. The truck passed through without any further change in temperature. The night offered no second event. For the rest of the drive, Aaron watched the display more often than the empty highway ahead. It stayed at 27 degrees. What remained with him was the order in which it had happened. The cold arrived first, before the lights became clear, before they lifted from the road, and before he understood that nothing ordinary was waiting ahead. The air had already changed. Then the cluster left. The warmth returned with it, degree by degree, until the desert was exactly as it had been, as if whatever had occupied that stretch of highway had carried its own climate into the night and taken it away again. Chapter 5. Window seat, row over the wing. The cabin had settled into the quiet middle of an overnight flight. Most of the passengers were asleep or trying to sleep. The ceiling lights had been lowered to a soft orange glow, leaving the aisle dim and the seat rows washed in shadow. Nearly every window shade was closed. One remained open over the wing. The passengers sitting there had spent much of the flight from Glasgow to Madrid looking outside. There was little to see at that hour. The land below had disappeared into darkness, and only the occasional cluster of distant lights marked a town or road. The red navigation light near the wingtip blinked at a steady pace. On, off, on again. Beyond it, farther to the left, another light appeared. It was white and brighter than the red light on the wing. It did not flash, it did not pulse or change color. It simply held its place in the black sky. The passenger assumed it belonged to another aircraft. That explanation felt natural at first. Planes often shared the same broad air routes, and at night, their position could be difficult to judge. A nearby aircraft might look like little more than a fixed lamp in the distance. He watched for it to move. It did not. He leaned closer to the window. The white point remained beyond the wing, separated from the blinking red navigation light by a stretch of darkness. He shifted in his seat. The light stayed where it was. He moved his head toward the aisle, then back toward the glass, testing whether it might be a reflection from inside the cabin. A reflection should have followed his viewing angle or weakened as he blocked the orange light behind him. This one remained unchanged. It was outside. The seat screen showed 147. He looked away for a while, partly to give his eyes a chance to adjust, and partly because he expected the situation to resolve itself. Another aircraft would eventually drift forward, fall behind, or change position against the wing. When he looked again, the light was still there. Its brightness had not altered. It cast no halo into the thin cloud below, and no pale wash over the wing. Nothing around it was illuminated. Only the point itself could be seen. At 1:51, it occupied the same place. That was when the passenger began to feel that something was wrong. Two aircraft traveling through the same region might seem motionless for a short time, but not perfectly so. Small differences in direction and speed would slowly change the angle between them. Even a distant plane should creep against the horizon or shift relative to the wing. The white light seemed fixed, not simply traveling beside the aircraft. Locked there, he continued watching until a flight attendant came along the aisle. Her name tag read Elena. The passenger lifted the shade a little higher and quietly asked whether she could look at something outside. He pointed beyond the wing, careful not to sound alarmed. Elena leaned toward the window. Her glance lasted perhaps half a second. "It's probably another aircraft," she said. The passenger explained that it had not moved for several minutes and had not blinked once. Elena looked toward the glass again, though not long enough to study the light. "At this altitude, it can look like that sometimes." Her voice remained calm and practiced. It was the kind of answer designed to settle a nervous traveler without disturbing the rest of the cabin. Then she continued along the aisle. The passenger returned his attention to the window. The red wingtip light blinked again, marking the aircraft's own position in a way the white light did not. The contrast made the second object appear stranger. One belonged to a machine following normal rules. The other did not seem to announce anything about itself. A few minutes later, the aircraft made a small course correction. The change was gentle, the sort most passengers would not notice unless they were looking directly at the wing. The wing dipped slightly, and the dark horizon shifted across the window. The white light stayed level. For an instant, the movement of the aircraft made the difference unmistakable. The wing moved beneath it. The cabin tilted. The line of the horizon changed. The light did not. It was not tied to the plane. The passenger sat back. That small correction had done what 10 minutes of watching could not. It had given him a reference point, and the result made no sense. The light was holding level, relative to something beyond the moving aircraft. Perhaps the ground, perhaps the horizon, perhaps nothing he could identify. A second attendant appeared farther down the aisle. She was older than Elena, perhaps in her late 40s, and her name tag read Marina. The passenger stopped her and described what he had seen. He asked whether someone in the cockpit might be able to confirm traffic on that side. Marina did not approach the window. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," she said. He repeated that the light had stayed perfectly level when the wing dipped. "It's likely another aircraft at cruising altitude." Her answer came quickly. She kept a polite distance from the seat and never turned her head toward the glass. The passenger thanked her. He did not ask again. Around him, the cabin continued sleeping. A blanket had slipped from the knees of the person across the aisle. Someone farther forward adjusted their seat and became still. The engines produced the same low, continuous sound beneath everything, yet the cabin seemed muted in a way he found difficult to describe. Not silent, reduced. Most of the shades remained closed, and no one else appeared to be watching the sky. The two attendants had offered the same explanation without taking enough time to test it. The passenger was alone with the light. At 1:56, it remained exactly where it had been. He watched for blinking. None came. He searched for the outline of wings or a body around the brightness. There was no shape he could follow, and no smaller navigation lights nearby. The white point did not brighten when the aircraft shifted through thin cloud. It did not dim when the wing changed angle. It gave no sign that it was moving through air at all. 2 minutes later, it vanished. The seat screen read 1:58. There was no fading, no sudden rise, no movement into the distance. One moment, the light occupied its fixed place beyond the wing. In the next, that part of the sky was empty. The passenger kept watching the space where it had been, expecting it to return or reappear farther away. It did not. The red navigation lamp continued blinking at the wingtip. The engines continued their low, steady hum. The cabin lighting remained orange and soft. Nothing inside the aircraft reacted to the disappearance. Everything carried on. By the time the flight reached Madrid, the experience had already begun to feel separate from the rest of the journey. There was no announcement, no visible concern among the crew, and no other passenger came forward to say they had noticed the same thing. The passenger had no photograph, only the sequence of times on the seat screen. 1:47, 1:51, 1:56. Gone at 1:58. For roughly 10 minutes, a steady white light held beside a moving aircraft without blinking, drifting, or changing its apparent distance. When the plane altered course, the light stayed level with something else, not with the aircraft. Then it disappeared without crossing even a fraction of the sky. It had never moved closer. It had never fallen behind. And during all those minutes above the dark land below, it never gave any sign that it noticed the aircraft beside it at all. Chapter 6. The circles behind him. The first alert arrived while Callum was still in bed. Then another came. A third followed before he had opened the first notification. Within less than a minute, his phone had received 16 motion alerts from the camera overlooking his back garden. Each one came from the same sensor, only a few seconds apart. Callum opened the live view. The small lawn behind his house appeared empty. A wooden fence enclosed 3 sides of it, with a shed standing near the far corner. The motion camera was fixed beneath the gutter, high enough to show almost the entire garden. Nothing moved on the screen. The night was windless. The grass lay dark and damp beneath the weak light from a nearby window. No animal crossed the frame. No branch reached close enough to trigger the sensor. His phone vibrated again. Instead of watching the live feed, Callum opened the first recorded clip. For a moment, it showed the same quiet garden. Then the grass in the middle of the lawn bent downward. It did not flatten. Gradually, a clean ring appeared almost at once, roughly 6 or 7 feet across. The blades along its outer edge pressed toward the ground together, forming an almost perfect circle. The center remained untouched. Callum replayed the clip. The same movement repeated. An outer band of grass folded down, while the patch in the middle stayed upright. The ring held for a few seconds, then slowly released. The blades lifted until the lawn looked normal again. There was no shadow passing over it, no visible shape. Nothing crossed in front of the camera. Callum opened the next recording. The circle formed again, slightly closer to the fence. Another clip showed it nearer the center of the garden. Each time, only the outer ring moved. It was as though pressure had been placed around the edge of a wide object, while its middle carried no weight at all. Wind could flatten grass in waves, but not in a closed circle with a still center. An animal would have disturbed the lawn unevenly. There was no sound on the recordings, beyond the faint hiss of the camera microphone. Callum sat up and listened to the house. Everything inside was quiet. He pulled on a sweatshirt and went downstairs without switching on the hallway light. The choice was instinctive. He knew there was no good reason to move silently in his own home. Yet he placed each foot carefully and avoided the loose board near the kitchen. The back door opened into cold air. A security lamp above the door came on, covering the lawn in hard white light. Nothing was there. Callum stood on the step and compared the garden with the image still open on his phone. The place where the first circle had appeared lay only a few yards away. He crossed to it. The grass was upright. He crouched and ran his palm over the area, feeling damp blades and cold soil beneath them. There was no flattened ring, no depression, and no broken stems. He checked farther toward the fence. Nothing. The clips showed the lawn being pressed down repeatedly. The lawn itself showed no sign that anything had touched it. Callum remained crouched, studying the ground, when his phone buzzed in his hand. Another motion alert. He opened the new recording. The camera showed the garden from above. Callum could see himself in the frame, crouching near the center of the lawn. The security light cast his shadow toward the shed. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a circle formed directly behind him. The ring pressed into the grass, only a few feet from his back. On the recording, Callum did not turn. He did not pause or look over his shoulder. His body showed no sign that anything unusual was happening nearby. The circle held. Then the grass lifted again. Callum looked behind him. The lawn appeared untouched. He replayed the clip from the beginning. There he was, kneeling with one hand against the ground. Behind him, the outer ring folded down in a smooth, even motion, close enough to reach. He watched the video again, paying attention to himself rather than the grass. There was no small reaction he had missed, no tightening of his shoulders, no movement of his head. He had felt nothing. No vibration through the ground. No passing air. No sound close to his ears. Whatever the camera had captured had happened within a few feet of him, without reaching any of his senses. That disturbed him more than the circle itself. Callum stood and backed toward the house, keeping the lawn in front of him. He expected the security light to reveal some change in the grass, but every blade remained upright. His phone vibrated once more. The latest clip showed a ring forming near the shed. It appeared, held briefly, and disappeared. After that, the alert stopped. Callum went inside and locked the door. He remained at the kitchen table with the live feed open in front of him. The garden stayed still. Minutes passed, then an hour. No further motion notifications appeared. He moved through the earlier recordings again, comparing the size and position of each circle. They were not all in the same place. The ring seemed to shift across the lawn, first near the center, then closer to the fence, then behind him, and finally beside the shed. There was no obvious path between them. Nothing visible traveled from one location to the next. Only the grass showed where the pressure had been. By morning, the garden looked ordinary beneath the gray daylight. Callum inspected every section caught on camera. He searched for bent stems, prints in the soil, disturbed insects, or any sign that the lawn had been pressed down during the night. There were no marks. Even the damp earth showed nothing. The recordings remained on his phone, clear enough to replay frame by frame. They showed the grass moving in a way he could not explain, yet the garden offered no physical proof. Callum could accept that a camera might record movement too subtle for a person to notice from inside a house. What he could not accept so easily was the clip filmed while he stood in the garden. The ring had formed directly behind him, near enough that he should have heard the grass bend, near enough that he should have felt the ground shift, but his body had registered nothing at all. Whatever had crossed the lawn did not simply remain unseen. It moved beyond touch, sound, and instinct, even when it was only a few feet away. Chapter 7. The 2 o'clock light. By the third night, Marcus had started checking the clock before he reached that part of the highway. His overnight route crossed the same long stretch of open land at roughly the same hour each night. There were no houses close to the road, no service stations, and no towns bright enough to stain the horizon. The highway ran through flat darkness for miles at a time. At 2:02 a.m., the orange light appeared to his right. Marcus had noticed it twice before. It hovered above the empty ground, perhaps 50 feet in the air, always in the same place relative to the road. There was no tower beneath it, no pole, hill, or building that could explain why a light would hang there night after night. It did not blink. It did not grow brighter as the truck approached. The color remained a steady, muted orange. On the first night, Marcus assumed it belonged to some distant structure hidden in the dark. A radio mast seen from the wrong angle. A warning lamp mounted above equipment too far away to make out. He looked for it in the side mirror after passing. Nothing appeared. The following night, the light returned. The clock showed 2:03. Marcus slowed as he came alongside it. The orange point stayed fixed above the same patch of land. When he increased his speed again, it did not seem to fall behind in the way a nearby object should. Then, as soon as he passed the area, it was gone. Not blocked by terrain. Gone. Marcus began watching for it each night. The timing was too consistent to ignore. He would drive for hours through ordinary darkness, enter that particular stretch shortly after 2, and find the orange light waiting in the same position. Some nights he reduced his speed well before reaching it. Other nights he accelerated. The light did not react. Its height never seemed to change. Its brightness remained steady, and it never revealed anything beneath it. Marcus reviewed his dashcam after the 4th appearance. He expected the footage to settle the question. A camera fixed to the windshield should have shown whether the light was close to the road or far beyond it. The recording showed only darkness. Marcus replayed the section from several minutes before the sighting to several minutes after. He watched frame by frame, using the road signs and lane markings to identify the exact location. There was no orange glow, no faint point near the horizon. Nothing. The road in the footage was empty. Marcus checked recordings from the other nights. The result was always the same. He could remember the light clearly, including where it sat in relation to the passenger side window, but the camera had captured no trace of it. That changed the way he thought about the sighting. A distant lamp could be misjudged. A reflection might appear at a certain angle, but reflections should appear on a camera mounted inside the same cab, especially when they returned on the same road at nearly the same time. Marcus decided to test it. One night, he pulled onto the shoulder about a mile before the place where the light usually appeared. He shut off the engine and turned off the headlights. The sudden quiet inside the truck felt deeper than expected. He lowered the window and waited. 5 minutes passed. The land remained black. No orange light rose in the distance. No vehicle approached from either direction. And as Marcus started the engine again and returned to the road, as he entered the familiar stretch, the light appeared. Same position, same height, same steady orange color. It had not been visible while he waited nearby. It showed itself only when he was moving through the exact place from which he had always seen it. After that, the light became part of the route. Marcus no longer reacted with the same sharp unease each time it appeared. He still watched it, but repetition had turned the event into something almost familiar. At 2 a.m, the road curved gently. The orange light waited beyond it. Then came the night, when it was no longer beside the highway. Marcus entered the usual stretch and glanced toward the right. The field was empty. For the first time in weeks, the light was not there. He looked back toward the lane ahead. The orange point was now directly in front of the truck, centered over the road. It hovered at roughly the same height as before, but instead of hanging over the empty land, it occupied the middle of his lane. Marcus lifted his foot from the accelerator. The distance between the truck and the light did not appear to change. He slowed further. It remained exactly as far ahead as it had been when he first saw it. Marcus pressed the accelerator again. The engine pulled harder, but the orange light held the same position in his view. It did not grow larger. It did not move closer. It stayed aligned with the center of the windshield, as though it belonged to the truck rather than to the road ahead. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He did not brake suddenly. The shoulders were narrow, and the land beyond them disappeared into darkness. Swerving away from something he could not judge might have been more dangerous than continuing straight. Marcus leaned toward the side window, trying to see around the light. There was nothing behind it. No mast, no vehicle, no beam reaching down to the asphalt. The orange point gave off no reflection on the hood, and no visible light on the lane markings. For about 5 seconds, it remained in front of him. Then the highway was empty again. There was no movement away. Marcus did not see it rise, fall, or leave the lane. It simply ceased to be there. He drove several miles before finding a safe place to stop. The dashcam was still recording. Marcus reviewed the footage immediately. The video showed the truck entering the familiar stretch. The road ahead remained clear. The lane markings flowed steadily beneath the headlights. There was no object centered in front of the windshield. For those 5 seconds, the recording showed nothing except open highway. The next night, the orange light had returned to the roadside. It hovered in its usual place at the usual hour, unchanged by what had happened. Marcus passed it without slowing. He no longer believed it was a fixed lamp or an accident of distance. It appeared only when he traveled through that section. It stayed beyond the reach of the camera, and on one night it had moved from the field to the center of his path, while maintaining a distance. No change and speed could alter. The light had placed itself exactly where Marcus needed to look. Only Marcus, only while he was moving, and nowhere the camera could see. You have reached the quieter middle of tonight's stories. Perhaps you are still listening closely. Perhaps the details have already begun to drift at the edge of sleep. Either way, thank you for staying here. If these encounters are helping the night pass, you can leave a like and subscribe, so the next quiet story is waiting when you return. And if you have ever noticed a moment when the night became suddenly completely still, you are welcome to share it in the comments. Our next account begins half an hour before sunrise, when a dog stopped walking and stared into an empty sky. Chapter 8. The dogs knew first. Milo stopped so suddenly that Dan nearly walked into him. One moment, the Labrador had been moving at his usual steady pace along the estate road. The next, all four paws were fixed to the pavement. His body became rigid, the leash pulled tight, and his head lifted toward the sky. Dan said his name. Milo did not respond. It was still dark, though sunrise was less than half an hour away. The housing estate remained mostly asleep. Rows of attached homes stood behind short gardens and low walls, their windows unlit. A few parked cars reflected the weak glow of the street lamps. Dan and Milo followed the same loop almost every morning. The dog knew every gate, hedge, and patch of grass along it. He sometimes paused for a smell or pulled toward another animal, but this was different. His ears pointed forward. His eyes followed something above the rooftops. Dan shortened the leash and looked upward. The sky seemed ordinary. A few stars remained visible in the fading darkness. Thin cloud lay farther east, but the area above the estate was mostly clear. Then a dog began barking several houses away. Another answered from somewhere behind them. Within seconds, barking rose from every direction. It was not the usual scattered noise of one animal disturbing another. The sound spread too quickly. Dogs across the neighborhood seemed to react at almost the same moment, and each one appeared to be facing the same part of the sky. The barking settled into one constant, unbroken wall of sound. Milo did not join them. He remained silent and completely still. Dan followed the angle of the dog's muzzle again. At first, there was nothing to see. Then he noticed that one section of the sky looked slightly different from the rest. The change was so faint that his eyes kept losing it. Stars inside that area seemed less sharp. They did not disappear, but their light weakened and blurred, as if viewed through a thin layer of moving glass. The affected region had a curved edge. As it crossed farther into view, the curve completed itself into a broad circular outline. The thing produced no light of its own. It was almost transparent. Dan could see the stars behind it, but they appeared dimmer while the shape passed over them. Once they emerged behind its far edge, they returned immediately to their normal brightness. It moved from left to right at a steady pace. There was no engine sound. No wind followed it. Nothing in the clouds marked its passage. Its size was impossible to judge. If the outline was high above the estate, it could have been enormous. If it was lower, it was still wide enough to cover a large part of the visible sky. Dan felt pressure gathering inside his ears. He swallowed, expecting them to clear. They did not. The air around him seemed denser, though there was no change in temperature and no breeze. Breathing required no effort, but each breath felt heavier than the one before. Milo continued tracking the object. Small turns of his head matched its movement exactly. Lights began coming on inside nearby houses. A bedroom curtain shifted. A porch lamp flickered to life farther down the road. No one came outside. No one looked up. The barking continued with the same force, every dog holding the sound. Rather than breaking into separate calls, Dan stepped away from the street lamp to see the sky more clearly. The circular region passed above the row of houses opposite him. Chimneys and roof lines remained visible beneath it, but the stars beyond grew soft wherever the outline moved. There was still no solid surface to follow, only an absence of sharpness. Then the barking ended. Every dog stopped at once. The sound was not reduced gradually. There were no final scattered barks fading across the neighborhood. It was cut off. The silence that replaced it seemed far deeper than the quiet before it began. Dan could hear the faint electrical hum of the street lamp and his own breathing. Somewhere inside one of the houses, a pipe knocked once. Milo remained frozen. The circular outline continued toward the far edge of the estate. The final stars behind it blurred briefly, then sharpened again. The pressure in Dan's ears began to ease. The shape passed out of sight, beyond the rooftops. For another moment, Milo stared at the place where it had gone. Then he blinked. He shook his head hard, the way he did after coming out of water, and the tension left his body. His tail lowered into its usual position. He sniffed the pavement and started walking as though the interruption had never occurred. Dan stayed where he was. The neighborhood lights remained on in several homes, but no doors opened. The estate seemed unaware of what had crossed above it, apart from the animals now quiet behind fences and walls. He eventually followed Milo along the normal route. The dog showed no fear. He pulled toward familiar hedges and stopped at the same corners he visited every morning. Nothing in his behavior suggested that he remembered freezing beneath the sky. Dan remembered. What troubled him most was the order in which it happened. Milo reacted first, then the other dogs. Only after the animals had fixed their attention overhead did Dan manage to see the faint distortion moving across the stars. They had sensed it before there was anything visible to a person, and when it was gone, their barking stopped with the same precision with which it had begun. Whatever crossed the estate made no noise of its own, yet every dog beneath it knew exactly where it was. Chapter 9. The Turbines That Turned. The first thing the driver noticed was not the light beyond the ridge. It was the wind turbines. He was heading home along a rural highway about 20 miles outside town, passing through a landscape of low hills and open fields. Turbines stood across the slopes in long, uneven rows, their red warning lights blinking at different distances through the darkness. He had driven that road many times. At night, the blades were never easy to follow. They moved slowly against the sky, sometimes disappearing into darkness before returning through the weak red glow from the towers. That night, every blade was still. The driver checked the grass beside the road. It moved clearly in his headlights. Long stems bent and lifted in the breeze, and loose dust crossed the asphalt in thin lines. The wind had not stopped. Only the turbines had. He looked toward the dashboard clock. 1:15 a.m. The nearest tower stood frozen above the road, its blades forming a dark shape against the sky. Beyond it, dozens more had stopped at different angles. There was no gradual slowing. No sign that one section of the wind farm had lost power before another. From the closest ridge to the distant hills, every machine appeared locked in place. The driver reduced his speed. A white glow showed behind the ridge ahead. At first, he assumed it came from maintenance work. Crews sometimes traveled through the wind farm after dark, and a strong work lamp hidden behind the hill might explain the light without revealing its source. But the glow did not spread across the ground. It sat above the ridgeline, soft and steady, like a star seen through mist. It did not flash, brighten, or move with any clear purpose. The driver rolled forward more slowly. His radio stopped. There was no burst of static and no fading signal. The music ended between one note and the next, leaving the speakers completely silent. A second later, the dashboard lights weakened. The gauges remained visible, but their glow dropped low enough that the driver glanced down, expecting the engine to lose power. The truck continued running. The headlights stayed on. Then one of the turbines began to turn. Not the blades. The entire upper structure rotated on the tower. The movement was slow and deliberate. The housing behind the blade shifted until the broad face of the turbine pointed toward the glow beyond the ridge. A second tower followed, then a third. The three nearest machines turned together, not with the wind, but toward the pale light. The driver stopped in the middle of the road. No vehicles approached from either direction. The highway was narrow and empty, disappearing into darkness behind him and curving through the hills ahead. He lowered the window. The breeze entered the cab immediately. Outside, the grass continued moving. The turbine blades remained frozen. The driver opened the door and stepped onto the asphalt. A pressure formed inside his ears. It felt similar to the change during a steep climb in an aircraft, though he was standing on level ground. He swallowed once, then again, but the pressure did not clear. The air seemed thicker beyond the truck. The white glow began to move sideways. It drifted along the ridge at a steady pace. The three turbines turned with it. Their towers made no loud mechanical noise, only a faint, deep strain carried across the field as the upper sections slowly followed the light. The rest of the wind farm remained motionless. The driver stood beside the truck and watched the three machines track something he could not yet see. The glow passed into the open space between two towers. Its shape became clearer. Then he realized that the light was not the object. The real object was the darkness behind it. A broad oval occupied the sky above the ridge, smooth and almost perfectly black. It had no lamps, windows, or visible surface details. It was noticeable only because it blocked the stars. The pale white glow moved across one edge of the oval. It was reflected light. As the object shifted, the stars behind it vanished beneath the dark shape and reappeared along its other side. Its size was difficult to judge, but it seemed wider than the space between the two nearest towers. It made no sound. The wind continued moving the grass below it, yet the oval did not sway or drift. It hovered above the ridge with a steadiness the turbines could not match, even when locked in place. The driver felt the pressure in his ears grow stronger. The object rose. Its movement was smooth and slow, like something lifting through water. There was no engine flare, no exhaust, and no change in the wind below. As it climbed, the underside turned slightly toward the road. For only a few seconds, the weak reflected glow traced a pattern beneath it. Faint circles. Several rings seemed to sit inside one another, etched or pressed into the dark surface. They produced no light of their own and disappeared whenever the angle changed. The oval continued upward, then it tilted. The motion was slight, but enough to narrow its shape against the sky. The reflected glow faded along its edge, and the object became almost indistinguishable from the darkness around it. Higher still, the stars disappeared behind it, then gradually returned. The black oval weakened until there was no clear boundary left to follow, and then the sky was whole again. The pressure inside the driver's ears released at once. His radio crackled. A broken fragment of the song returned through the speakers, followed by normal sound. Across the field, one turbine made a deep metallic groan. Its blades began to turn. Another followed several seconds later. then another. Movement spread slowly across the wind farm. Blades that had been fixed against the sky started rotating again, one tower after the next, catching the same wind that had been blowing the entire time. The 3 turbines that had faced the object remained turned toward the ridge for a little longer. Then they began to correct their position. Machinery returning to work. The driver climbed back into the truck. His dashboard lights had recovered. No warning lamps were visible, and the engine sounded unchanged. He looked at the clock. 1:27 a.m. 12 minutes had passed. The driver checked the time again, certain he had read it incorrectly. The entire event had felt brief. 2 minutes, perhaps. Long enough to step outside, and watch the object rise. Not 12. He remained parked while the turbines turned above the fields. Their blades moved with the breeze. Their warning lights blinked, and the radio played as if its silence had never occurred. The wind farm had returned to normal. Every machine was moving. Every star was back in place. Only the clock refused to agree. Chapter 10. One frame in the storm. Louis had gone to the reservoir because the weather looked promising. A storm was building beyond the far shore, still distant enough to leave the water calm, but close enough for lightning to pulse inside the cloud bank. It was the kind of evening he liked to photograph. Dark sky, open water, no buildings in the way. He set his tripod beside a low concrete barrier near the edge of the reservoir. Dusk had almost ended. The clouds were moving in from the west, broad layers sliding across one another, while faint flashes lit them from inside. Louis adjusted the camera for long exposures and began waiting between each burst. Click. A few seconds of open shutter, then another wait. He had done this many times before. Most of the work was patience. The camera stayed fixed while he watched the same section of sky, hoping the next flash would reveal more detail than the last. No one else was nearby. The reservoir reflected a dull strip of gray from the fading sky. Wind moved lightly over the surface, but the storm had not yet reached the shore. Most of the clouds followed the same direction. A few patches seemed slower. Louis noticed this without giving it much thought. Some layers were darker and heavier than others, and distance could make their speed difficult to judge. Storm systems rarely moved as one clean sheet. He kept taking photographs. One flash was sharper than the rest. It lit the clouds from behind with a hard white burst, revealing edges and folds that had been invisible a moment earlier. Louis pressed the shutter at almost the same instant. The light vanished. The sky returned to darkness. He checked the camera screen briefly. The frame looked much like the others at that size. Cloud, lightning, and the faint reflection on the water. Nothing unusual stood out. 10 minutes later, the storm began moving closer. Louis packed the tripod and returned home before the rain arrived. He discovered the shape while reviewing the photographs on his laptop. The first images were ordinary. Several were underexposed. One contained a good fork of lightning behind the cloud base. Another caught a pale line across the water. Then he opened the frame from the sharper flash. At first, he thought a section of the cloud had simply come out too dark. A triangular patch sat inside the illuminated bank, darker than the layers around it. Louis increased the image size and leaned closer to the screen. The shape became clearer. 3 edges, 3 points. The lines were too straight for anything else in the photograph. The triangle did not glow. It did not reflect the lightning in the way the surrounding cloud did. It looked denser than a shadow, almost solid, as though the flash had briefly exposed the outline of something hidden inside the storm. Louis zoomed in again. The shape was large. There was no reliable way to measure it without knowing its distance, but it occupied a broad section of the cloud bank. If it sat within the storm, it was far larger than any aircraft he knew. He opened the photograph taken immediately before it. The same area of sky was empty. He checked the next frame. Nothing there either. Only cloud. Louis moved back and forth between the three images. Before, the triangle. After. The timestamp on the central frame matched the sharp flash he remembered. It had not appeared in a photograph from another part of the evening, or in a different direction. The camera had been aimed at the exact section of sky he had watched the whole time. He adjusted the brightness. The triangle became easier to see. He raised the contrast. Its edges grew more distinct. If the shape had been an accidental dark patch caused by exposure, those changes might have broken it apart or blended it into the surrounding cloud. Instead, each adjustment strengthened the same outline. Louis stopped editing and returned the photograph to its original state. The triangle was still there. He began looking for an ordinary explanation. Clouds could form sharp-looking patterns for an instant. Human vision was good at finding familiar shapes where none existed. Three darker regions might seem connected because the mind wanted them to be. He understood that. For a long time, he tried to see the image that way. A cloud gap, a shadow, three unrelated lines, meeting by chance, but the shape did not shift when he looked away and returned. Its edges remained in the same places. The points stayed clean. The surrounding cloud had soft, broken forms, while the triangle appeared separate from them, more solid. Louis checked the file information to make sure the image had not been damaged. He examined the lens for marks and searched other photographs for the same pattern. When nothing matched, a flaw on the lens would have repeated across multiple frames. A sensor problem would not have appeared only once. The most difficult part was not what the camera had recorded. It was what Louis had failed to see. He had been watching that exact area of the sky. His eyes were fixed there because he was waiting for lightning. When the sharp flash lit the clouds, he had seen the storm brighten. He had not seen a triangle, not even for a moment. The camera had captured something his eyes had missed completely. Louis returned to the image. Over the following days, sometimes he convinced himself it was only an unusual cloud formation. Then he would compare it with the frames on either side, and lose that certainty again. The sky had changed very little between the photographs. The triangular shape had appeared and disappeared within that narrow gap, present for one frame, absent everywhere else. Louis still keeps the original file saved. He has never claimed to know what the shape was. There was no sound, no movement he could track, and no second witness standing beside him. Only a single photograph, taken during one bright flash inside a storm. 3 straight edges, meeting at 3 points. They're long enough for the camera to hold it, and gone before the human eye knew there was anything to see. Chapter 11. The Star That Waited. The sky above eastern Wyoming was clear enough to make distance feel almost unreal. Behind his cousin Lena's house, the land opened into a wide field of tall, dry grass. The property sat about a quarter-mile from the main road, far enough away that passing traffic reached it only as a faint hum. There were no street lamps nearby, and no neighboring windows bright enough to wash out the stars. He had carried a blanket into the field after dinner, and lay on his back beneath the open sky. The night was chilly, but not uncomfortable. A light breeze moved through the grass around him, creating a soft, steady rustle. Insects called from the darker edges of the field. Above them, the Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other, like a pale cloud that never moved. He was not searching for anything unusual. He was simply looking up. One star began to brighten. It did not flare suddenly. Its light grew stronger in a smooth, measured way, held for a moment, and then faded back to its original level. A little over 1 second later, it happened again. Bright. Dim. Pause. Bright again. He watched through several cycles before sitting up slightly. Stars often appeared to flicker near the horizon, where their light passed through more of the atmosphere. But this point was higher in the sky, a little right of center, surrounded by other stars that showed only the usual uneven shimmer. This one had a rhythm. He counted quietly. Each pulse arrived a little more than a second after the last. The timing was not perfectly mechanical, but it was far too even to resemble ordinary twinkling. He blinked several times and rubbed his eyes. The pulse continued. He looked away toward a brighter star, then returned to the original point. It resumed exactly where he expected it to be, still rising and falling in the same calm beat. Nothing else in the sky behaved that way. He wondered whether an aircraft might be moving directly toward him, its warning light appearing fixed because of the angle. Yet there was no red or green companion light, and no sound of engines. The point did not grow larger or shift against the stars surrounding it. It remained still. Only the brightness changed. The breeze stopped. The grass around the blanket had been moving continuously since he came outside. Then, within a few seconds, the rustling ceased. The tall stems stood almost motionless. The insects went quiet soon afterward. A truck could still be heard, somewhere on the distant highway, but even that sound seemed to weaken until the field felt separated from the rest of the night. The star kept pulsing. He reached toward the phone lying beside him. The instant his fingers touched it, the light stopped. There was no final dimming cycle. It froze at an ordinary brightness and became indistinguishable from the other stars. His hand remained on the phone. The field stayed quiet. He unlocked the screen and opened the camera, though he no longer knew which point he should aim at. Without the pulse, there was nothing to mark it. The sky was too crowded, and every star near that area looked almost identical. He lowered the phone. After 20 or 30 seconds, the light began again. One slow rise, one smooth fall, then another. He did not move. The steady rhythm continued as though nothing had interrupted it. He raised his right hand toward the phone without touching it. The star stopped halfway through a pulse. Its brightness held in place. He froze with his arm suspended a few inches above the blanket. The light stayed fixed. Slowly, he lowered his hand. Nothing happened at first. Then, after another short wait, the star resumed the pattern from the brightness at which it had stopped. It dimmed, paused, and began to rise again. He tested it once more. His hand moved upward. The pulse halted. His hand returned to the blanket. The rhythm came back after roughly 20 seconds. A coincidence could explain one interruption. Two became harder. By the third test, he no longer believed he was watching an ordinary star. He lay completely still, breathing softly, afraid that a larger movement might end the pattern for good. The feeling was not exactly fear. It was closer to the discomfort of realizing that something far away had noticed him noticing it. The sky no longer felt empty. The pulsing point remained tiny, no larger than any other star. Yet the distance between them seemed less important now. His smallest movement toward the phone produced an immediate response. It was not simply there. It was waiting. He considered leaving the camera open and moving slowly enough that the light would not react, but the previous tests had shown that he did not need to touch the device. The intention alone seemed enough, provided his hand moved toward it. That thought unsettled him more than the light itself. He watched for another minute without moving. The pulses continued, each one arriving with the same patient timing. The field around him remained windless and quiet. Then his phone screen lit up. He had not touched it. The display came on for less than a second, bright against the blanket, and went dark again. There was no notification sound, no message, no incoming call. He grabbed the phone and checked the screen. Nothing new appeared. When he looked back at the sky, the pulsing had ended. The point was still there, or he believed it was, but now it shone with the same weak, steady light as every star around it. He waited. A minute passed, then another. The rhythm did not return. The breeze slowly moved back through the grass. The insects resumed their uneven calls. A truck traveled along the highway, its sound growing and then fading in the distance. The field had released him. He stayed outside longer than he intended, staring at the same section of sky and trying to identify the correct star. Without the change in brightness, he could not be certain which one it had been. The next night, he returned to the blanket. Conditions were almost identical. The air was dry and cool, the Milky Way clear, and the same stars visible above Lena's field. Nothing pulsed. He opened a star map application and held the phone against the sky, searching for a star in the position he remembered. Several possible matches appeared, but none sat exactly where he expected. Perhaps his memory of the angle was wrong. Perhaps the Earth had shifted the sky enough to make the comparison difficult. Or perhaps the point had never been a star at all. He never saw it again. Of every detail from that night, one pattern remained impossible for him to dismiss. The light behaved normally until he reached for a way to record it. And each time his hand moved toward the phone, the pulse stopped. Each time he lowered it, the slow rhythm returned, and when the phone finally lit on its own, the star became ordinary, and stayed that way. Chapter 12. 40 miles from Groom Lake. The crosswind had been pushing against the Cherokee since sunset. The private pilot was returning from a supply flight to Tonopah, working the controls in small, constant movements as the aircraft crossed the open desert. A steady wind from the south, close to 25 knots, kept lifting one wing and then the other. Nothing dangerous, just enough to demand attention. Below him, dry lake beds and pale strips of desert were losing their color. Highway 375 ran through the emptiness like a thin, dark thread. Farther east lay the restricted airspace around Groom Lake. He was still about 40 miles west of it. Legal civilian airspace. The sun had dropped below the horizon, but a deep orange band remained in the west. Against that fading light, the pilot noticed a dark patch off his right side. At first, he thought it was a flaw in the windshield. He shifted his head. The patch stayed outside. It was darker than the sky around it, though not in the way a cloud was dark. Clouds caught some trace of the dying sunlight along their edges. This shape reflected nothing. It looked matte, a stretched oval, perhaps 20 or 30 feet across, with an outline that seemed firm in one moment and difficult to hold in the next. The object hovered at roughly the same altitude as the Cherokee, about half a mile away. The pilot watched it through the right side of the canopy while keeping one hand steady on the yoke. The aircraft rocked again under the crosswind. The oval did not move. Nothing remained perfectly still in air like that. A balloon would drift, a drone would correct and sway. Even a helicopter would show movement in its attitude or position. This thing held itself against the sky, as though the wind did not exist. The pilot checked his instruments. Altitude steady. Heading steady. Engine readings normal. The portable ADS-B display clipped to the panel showed no traffic nearby. That system was designed to show other aircraft broadcasting their position. The space around his own symbol was empty. He looked outside again. The object was still there, a little lower now, perhaps a couple 100 feet beneath him, though he could not tell whether it had descended or whether the Cherokee's own movement had changed the angle. It remained about half a mile off the right wing. The pilot reached for the radio. Niner 1 Bravo to Albuquerque Center. Do you have any traffic east of my position? A short pause followed. Albuquerque Center answered that he was the only aircraft in the corridor. The pilot scanned the ADS-B display again. Nothing. He looked toward the object and tried to place it against the ground below. There were no roads directly beneath it, no buildings, no moving lights, and no dust rising from the desert. He banked gently to the right. The Cherokee's wing dipped into the crosswind. The object tilted to face him. The movement was smooth and immediate. The entire oval shifted its orientation without showing a hinge, a tail, a wing, or any fixed point around which it turned. It did not rotate like an aircraft changing direction. It simply presented a different side scene. The pilot felt a sharp rush of adrenaline. He leveled the Cherokee. The oval stopped moving. Once again, it hovered without sway or correction, while the wind continued to buffet the aircraft around him. The feeling that followed was unlike anything he had experienced in a cockpit. It was not only that something unusual was sharing the airspace, it was the sense that the object had responded. The pilot had turned toward it, and it had turned toward him. He kept the Cherokee on course and watched through the right side of the canopy. The oval seemed to match his general direction while holding the same distance. The aircraft rose and fell slightly in the rough air. The object did neither. Its stillness made the movement of the plane feel exaggerated. Each shake of the wing, each correction on the yoke, each small change in altitude showed how active the atmosphere was, and still the oval remained fixed. The pilot called Albuquerque Center again. He asked whether any restricted operations were active from the head of his position. The reply came back calm and procedural. Affirmative, 1 Bravo. All clear. Maintain heading. No special traffic had been reported. No warning had been issued. As the last orange light left the desert floor, the object became even stranger. It did not catch the fading sunset. The sky around it changed from orange to deep blue, then toward black. The oval stayed darker than all of it, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it, like a hole cut into the sky. The pilot tried to judge whether it had a solid surface. He could not see panels, seams, windows, or any sign of construction. The shape appeared smooth, but even that was uncertain, because the edges never seemed completely stable to his eyes. Then it began to rise. There was no warning movement, no nose lifting, no visible effort. One moment, it hovered beside him. The next, it was dozens of feet higher. The pilot watched for an acceleration curve, expecting the movement to begin slowly and build speed. There was none. The object climbed vertically at a constant, impossible rate. It moved like an elevator, with no cable, no tower, and no resistance from the air. No sound reached the cockpit. No dust rose from the desert below it. Nothing trailed behind. Within seconds, the oval was hundreds of feet above its starting point. Then it stopped. The pause came at roughly 1,000 feet above where it had first hovered. The object held there, steady once more. A burst of static entered the pilot's headset. It lasted less than a second. Then came a faint two-tone pattern. Two clean sounds, one slightly higher than the other. Not a voice, not ordinary radio interference. The tones repeated once and disappeared. The pilot pressed the transmit switch. Niner 1 Bravo, radio check. Albuquerque Center answered immediately, loud and clear. The radio system appeared normal. The oval remained above and to the right. For one final time, it tilted. Not toward the east, not toward the restricted airspace, toward the Cherokee's flight path. The motion was slight, yet deliberate enough that the pilot recognized the same response he had seen earlier. The object seemed to face him again. Then it rose. It accelerated, straight upward without changing angle. Its dark shape grew smaller against the deepening sky, though no light marked its position, and no trail followed its climb. The pilot kept his eyes on it for as long as possible. The oval became a black mark, then a point, then nothing. It did not vanish in a flash. It seemed to dissolve into the dark, leaving no clear instant when shape became empty sky. The pilot continued toward his home airstrip. He did not report the full encounter over the radio. He had no useful language for it, and the airspace around him had already been confirmed clear. When he arrived, Tom was waiting near the strip. Tom monitored local traffic from his home and was familiar with the aircraft that passed through the area. The pilot asked whether he had seen anything unusual. Tom had not. No strange lights, no second aircraft, no radar disturbance that he knew of. The pilot said little more. Later, he reviewed the GPS track from the flight. The route looked normal. Heading, altitude, and speed remained within the range he remembered. Then he found a gap, less than 1 second missing from the timestamp. It occurred at the exact point in the flight, when the oval began its vertical ascent. The gap was too short to explain the event, and too small to be meaningful on its own. A brief recording error could happen for many ordinary reasons, but it was there. One lost instant in an otherwise complete record. The instruments had shown an empty sky. Albuquerque Center had confirmed it twice. Tom had seen nothing from the ground, yet the pilot had watched a matte black oval hold motionless in a 25-knot crosswind, turn to face his aircraft, climb without sound, pause above him, and leave through the darkening sky. And at the moment it rose, the flight log lost less than a second. The next witness would lose more. He would not have to discover it in a recording. Someone would tell him. Chapter 13. The Men at the Grain Elevator. At 2:14 a.m., the coffee in Kevin Dalton's mug became perfectly still. He noticed, because it was never still. The control office sat beside the steel silos of a grain elevator outside a small farming town in western Nebraska. During harvest season, the place carried a constant vibration. Conveyor belts moved grain through enclosed passages. Ventilation fans pushed air into the storage bins. Motors pulsed through the walls and floor. That low movement reached everything. It trembled through the desk. It traveled into the chair. It made small rings spread across the surface of Kevin's coffee whenever he set the mug down. Then the ring stopped. Kevin looked at the cup before he understood what had changed. The vibration beneath his feet had vanished. He raised his head and listened. The ventilation hum had dropped so low that he could barely hear it. The fans had not fully stopped yet, but their normal steady sound had weakened into something distant and strained. Several digital readouts on the control panel flickered. For 1 second, every number disappeared. Black screens. Then the figures returned. Storage levels, motor temperatures, conveyor status, all normal. Kevin stood and walked to the office window. Outside, the silos rose above the gravel yard in pale rows, their curved walls catching the weak security lights. The loading tracks ran between them and disappeared into darkness. Beyond the elevator, wheat fields stretched across the flat prairie. The wind had stopped. Only moments earlier, dry grass along the gravel road had been moving steadily. Now every stalk stood motionless. Kevin opened the office door. Cold air rested outside without movement. The silence was not complete. The fans still turned somewhere inside the elevator, though more slowly than they should have. Metal cooled and shifted within the silos, but the open land made no sound. No wind through the wheat, no insects, no distant truck on the county road. Kevin stepped into the yard. Something above the silos caught his attention. At first, it appeared to be a wide patch of unusually clear sky. The stars were visible inside it, but their positions looked wrong. Their light was bending. Kevin stared upward. Across a broad section of the sky, the stars curved inward toward a center he could not see. The effect was faint near the edges and stronger closer to the middle. Points of light that should have remained fixed seemed stretched into shallow arcs. There was no solid object blocking them, no outline, nothing dark enough to call a shape, only the distortion. It moved across the sky from west to east. Slowly, the stars bent as it approached, then returned to normal behind it. Whatever caused the effect seemed enormous, far wider than the largest silo, yet almost completely invisible. Kevin walked farther into the yard. As the distortion passed above the first storage towers, the steel began to make quiet ticking sounds. One tick, then another. The noise moved across the elevator with the thing overhead. The catwalk connecting two silos creaked, though there was no wind pushing against it, and no one standing on the metal grating. Kevin felt the sound through the soles of his boots. The invisible mass crossed the center of the property. Then it stopped, directly above him. The bent stars held in place. For several seconds, Kevin could see the shape only through what it did to the light around it. A vast region of the night sky seemed drawn inward, as though the stars were being viewed through a thick curved surface. A pale glow appeared. It did not shine down in a beam. It spread gently across the yard, coloring the gravel and the rounded sides of the silos with a washed-out white light. The shadows of the towers lengthened in the wrong direction. Kevin looked down at his own shadow. It stretched across the gravel toward the office, thin and distorted. The glow strengthened. Then it vanished. The invisible shape moved, not gradually. The bent region of stars shot across the sky so quickly that Kevin lost it, almost at once. The distortion passed beyond the elevator, crossed the flat horizon, and disappeared. The wind returned with force. Wheat bent across the fields in a sudden wave. Dust moved along the gravel road. The ventilation fans roared back to full speed, sending their vibration through the ground and into Kevin's legs. The elevator was alive again. He turned toward the office. That was when he saw the sedan. A black car stood beside the gravel road near the edge of the property. Kevin had not heard it arrive. There had been no engine, no tires on the loose gravel, and no sweep of headlights across the silos. It had simply appeared during the few seconds when his attention was on the sky. Two men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, and black ties. Neither had a jacket, despite the cold prairie air. The taller man had dark hair combed straight back. The other was broader through the shoulders. Under the yard lights, his skin looked unusually pale, almost gray. They were looking up at the silos. Kevin remained where he was. The tall man turned toward him. You observed the passage. He did not ask it as a question. Kevin looked from the men to the sky. What passage? A transit object? The answer came without hesitation. Kevin took several steps closer, though he kept part of the gravel yard between them. Who are you? We observe unusual crossings, the tall man said. The broader man remained near the passenger side of the sedan. His hands rested at his sides. He did not seem uncomfortable in the cold. Kevin asked whether they worked for the grain company. No. Military? No. The tall man looked toward the control office. You're the only operator on site tonight. Kevin felt something in his chest tighten. How do you know that? We checked the elevator staffing records. There was nothing threatening in the man's tone. That made the words worse. He spoke as though accessing a private work schedule in the middle of the night. Required no explanation. Kevin glanced toward the road. No second vehicle waited nearby. No lights approached from town. The black sedan had no visible markings. What was that thing? He asked. The tall man looked briefly toward the horizon, where the distortion had vanished. Things that move through this region. What things? The man did not answer. The broader one continued, watching Kevin with a still expression. His face showed no impatience and no curiosity. He seemed to be waiting for the conversation to reach a point already known to him. The tall man stepped closer. You should log the fan interruption as routine electrical interference. Kevin looked back toward the office. That's not what caused it. It will be the explanation that remains. The words were delivered quietly, not as advice, as a statement of what would happen. Kevin had worked around electrical systems long enough to know what an ordinary fault looked like. A voltage drop might dim panels or stop a motor. It would not silence the wind. It would not bend starlight over the silos or make an unseen sedan appear beside the road. He asked whether the object would return. The tall man paused. It doesn't repeat the same crossing. That answer gave Kevin no comfort. The men turned toward the car. The broader one opened the passenger door. The tall man walked around the front of the sedan and took the driver's side. Neither moved quickly, neither looked back at the sky. Kevin followed several steps across the gravel. Wait. The car doors closed. The engine started so quietly that Kevin felt its vibration before he heard it. The sedan began rolling toward the road. Then the passenger window lowered. The broader man looked out at Kevin. You lost about 40 seconds during the passage. Kevin stopped walking. I was standing here the whole time. The man held his gaze. Time compresses near certain events. The window rose. The sedan reached the road and turned away from the elevator. Its rear lights moved across the dark prairie, growing smaller until the road became empty again. No sound remained but the fans in the wind. Kevin stood beneath the silos. The conversation had lasted only a few minutes. Yet the yard felt different after the car left. Not changed in any visible way, reduced somehow, as if the night had closed over whatever opening had briefly formed above the elevator. Empty prairie road, nothing else. Kevin returned to the control office. The coffee in his mug was moving again. Small rings spread across its surface with the vibration of the machinery. He opened the system log. The ventilation fans had shut down for exactly 40 seconds. Kevin read the entry twice. 40 seconds. The same amount of time the man in the sedan had named before leaving, but another timestamp appeared beside the interruption. According to the control panel, the event had begun almost a full minute before the fan stopped spinning. Kevin compared the readings. The system showed the first disturbance, then a gap that should not have existed. Only later did the physical machinery respond. The log did not explain where those missing moments belonged. It did not show why the timestamp and the fan shut down disagreed. It simply recorded two parts of the same event, as though time inside the elevator had no longer been moving at one steady rate. Kevin remained in the office until sunrise. He entered routine electrical interference in the report. It was not what caused the interruption, but it became the explanation that remained, and Kevin Dalton became the witness promised at the beginning of tonight's stories. He did not have to wonder how much time had been taken from him. Someone arrived in the dark and told him exactly 40 seconds. Chapter 14. The Still Water. The fisherman noticed the boundary only after he began reeling in his line. It was early morning, just after sunrise, at a small lake he visited once or twice each month. There was no proper dock, only a narrow muddy bank, a strip of reeds, and a few worn places where people had stood often enough to press the grass down. The sky held a pale gray-blue light. A mild breeze crossed the lake from left to right, covering the surface with steady ripples. They moved in loose rows toward the shore, catching the early light along their edges, except near him. Within roughly 6 feet of the bank, the water was completely flat. The fisherman lowered his rod and studied it. The still section formed a broad circle centered on the place where he stood. Outside it, the breeze continued shaping the lake. Small waves traveled toward the shore in their normal pattern. When they reached the edge of the circle, they stopped it. There was no gradual weakening, no smooth change from moving water to calm water. The ripples simply ended at a clean, invisible boundary. Inside that line, the surface looked like dark glass. The fisherman moved one step sideways. At first, he thought the shape belonged to a sheltered pocket near the reeds. Perhaps the bank blocked the wind at that angle, or something beneath the surface changed the current. Then the still water shifted with him. The circle remained centered on his position. He stepped back to where he had been. It followed. The breeze touched his face and moved the reeds beside him. Yet the water within that 6-foot area remained untouched. He picked up a small pebble from the mud. Rather than throwing it into the center, he tossed it beyond the strange boundary. The stone struck the moving water with a normal splash. Small waves spread outward from the point of impact. Some traveled away across the lake. Others moved toward the fisherman. They reached the edge of the flat area and stopped it. The waves did not cross into it. The surface inside stayed smooth. The fisherman watched the boundary for several seconds. Nothing marked it. There was no change in color, no floating debris, and no line of weeds beneath the water. Only movement on one side, stillness on the other. He lowered the tip of his fishing rod into the calm section near his boots. The rod touched the water. Circular ripples formed around it and spread outward. This time, the waves began inside the still area. They moved normally for several feet, then reached the same unseen edge. Each one ended there. The disturbance did not continue into the open lake. It was as though the circle held its own separate surface. The fisherman crouched. He placed his fingers into the water. It felt ordinary, cold, wet, no unusual resistance. Pressed against his skin, nothing pulled at his hand. He moved his fingers beneath the surface and watched the small waves reach the boundary and disappear. When he lifted his hand, droplets fell from his fingertips. They dropped straight down. There was no wide scatter when they struck, no small spray spreading outward across the surface. Each drop seemed to vanish, into the still patch with less disturbance than it should have made. He stood again. A faint pressure had begun forming in his ears. It was mild, easy to ignore at first, like the feeling before a change in weather. He swallowed, but it remained. The circle reflected the pale sky more clearly than the rest of the lake. Outside it, the moving water broke the reflection into fragments. Inside, the image was nearly perfect. The surface seemed heavier, not thicker in a way he could touch, but visually dense, as if the lake had become something more solid around him. The fisherman took several careful steps along the bank. The flat area traveled with him. Ripples continued to meet its edge and disappear. Reeds moved in the wind beside his legs. The mud gave softly beneath his boots. The lake did not change. Only the parts surrounding him did. He moved farther from the water. The circle followed until he reached the upper part of the bank. Then it began to shrink. The invisible boundary drew inward toward the shore. 6 feet became 4, 4 became 2. The mirrored surface remained smooth while the moving water pressed against it from outside. The pressure inside his ears weakened. He stepped back once more. The still patch remained at the water's edge. For a moment, it held there, without him. Then the first small ripple crossed through. Another followed. Movement returned softly, spreading across the flat surface until the separate circle no longer existed. Within seconds, the breeze had reclaimed the whole lake. Nothing marked where the boundary had been. The fisherman walked down to the edge again. The water behaved normally around his boots. Waves reached the mud and pulled back. Droplets fell from his fingers with ordinary splashes. He picked up his rod and cast the line out from habit. The float settled beyond the reeds and began moving gently with the surface. He could not keep his eyes on it. For those few minutes, the lake itself had remained unchanged. The wind still moved across it. The reeds still bent. Ripples continued traveling toward the shore. Only the water around him had become still. And wherever he moved, the stillness had followed. Chapter 15. The Band of Light. At 5:12 a.m., a narrow strip of light was moving down the bedroom wall. The man watching it had been awake for only a few seconds. He lay on his side beneath the covers, still caught between sleep and full awareness, trying to understand why the room looked different. The band was only a few inches wide. Its edges were clean and perfectly straight. It stretched across most of the wall, moving downward at a slow, even pace, as though an unseen line were scanning the room from top to bottom. There was no flicker, no wobble from a passing branch, no widening or narrowing as it crossed the painted surface. A vehicle outside might have thrown light through the window, but passing headlights normally swept at an angle. They changed shape as the vehicle moved. They brightened, stretched, and vanished. This light stayed level. Its path did not match the position of the window. The band reached the lower part of the wall and stopped a few inches above the floor. That was where his shoes sat. They were placed side by side against the baseboard, exactly where he had left them before going to bed. The light held above them for about 2 seconds. Then it faded. It did not slide away or reverse direction. The brightness simply weakened until the wall was dark again. He checked the clock. 5:12 a.m. For the rest of that morning, he treated the experience as something ordinary seen while half asleep. A delivery vehicle might have turned nearby. A reflection could have moved across the window from a source he had not noticed before. The explanation felt less convincing when the band returned. 2 mornings later, he woke at 5:11. The room was dark. A few seconds passed and the light appeared near the top of the wall. It moved downward at the same speed, The same width, the same smooth, controlled path. Once again, it stopped above the shoes. 2 seconds, then darkness. Over the next several weeks, the pattern repeated. Not every morning, but often enough that he began expecting it. The time remained close to 5:10 or 5:12. Sometimes he woke while the light was already halfway down the wall. Soon he began waking before it arrived. No alarm sounded. His eyes would open at 5:10, and he would lie still in the dark, waiting. Within a minute or two, the band would appear. He mentioned it once to his neighbor Mark. Mark suggested a delivery van. Someone turning into the street before sunrise might send a strip of light across the room. It was the simplest answer, and the man wanted it to be correct. But he knew the angle of his own window. A vehicle on the road would have sent light upward or sideways. It could not have produced a horizontal line moving straight down the interior wall. The next time the band appeared, he sat upright to study it more carefully. A faint shimmer surrounded it. The effect resembled heat haze above a road, though the room was cool. The wall behind the band seemed to blur slightly, then returned to normal after it passed. He raised one hand into its path. The light reached his fingers. He felt nothing, no warmth, no cold, no tingling against the skin. Yet, while the band rested across his hand, the outline of his fingers became unclear. The edges softened, as though viewed through moving air. When the light continued downward, his hand looked normal again. The shoes remained in their usual place. The band stopped above them, held, faded. That morning, he decided to change the room. He moved the shoes away from the wall and placed them deeper inside the bedroom. Then he waited for the next appearance. Several mornings passed before he woke at 5:11 and saw the clean strip near the ceiling. It traveled down the wall. This time, it did not stop where the shoes had been. It continued all the way to the floor. The band rested there briefly, touching the baseboard, before fading. The next night, he returned the shoes to their usual position. When the light appeared again, it stopped early, exactly above them. He repeated the test with a chair. The chair normally stood near another wall. He moved it into the band's path and placed the shoes somewhere else. The light traveled past the old shoe position. It did not pause at the chair. It reached the floor and disappeared. He restored the room to its normal arrangement, shoes beside the wall. Chair returned to its usual place. The band stopped early again, at the same point above the shoes. It was not stopping at the floor. It was not reacting to any object placed in its way. It seemed to recognize the room as it normally was. That thought changed the experience. Until then, the light had felt strange but distant, like an unexplained reflection entering from outside. Now it seemed to be following a pattern. It had learned where something belonged, or it had been watching long enough to know. The next escalation came without warning. The man woke and looked toward the wall. No band was there. Instead, a thin strip of light had formed across the ceiling. It moved slowly from one side of the room toward the bed. The shimmer around it was stronger now. The ceiling seemed to ripple as the line crossed it, though the surface itself remained still. The band reached the space directly above him. Then it stopped. A faint hum filled the room. It was less a sound than pressure inside the ears. He felt it behind his jaw and deep within his head, steady and low. The light held above the bed for around 5 seconds. He did not move. Then both the band and the pressure disappeared. The following morning, nothing happened. Nor the morning after that. When the light returned, it behaved differently again. He woke to find it already low on the wall. It was not moving. The strip remained fixed just above the shoes, brighter than before. The air around it shimmered enough to make the wall appear soft and unstable. The man sat up. The band snapped sideways, only a few inches. The movement was sudden, almost like a reaction. Then it went dark. He turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room. Nothing had been disturbed. At first, everything appeared exactly where it belonged. Then he noticed the shoes. They were still beside the wall, but both had been turned slightly outward, not far. Only enough that their position looked unfamiliar. He was certain he had left them straight. After that, he began sleeping, with the curtains fully closed and the shoes placed inside a cupboard. The precautions changed nothing. The final event began with light already lying across the bed. He opened his eyes around 5:10 and saw the band over his legs. It rested across the blanket, perfectly straight from one side of the mattress to the other. The cloth beneath it appeared slightly blurred, though he could still see its folds. The line began to move upward. Slowly, it crossed his knees and continued over his thighs. He tried to move one leg and found that he could, but the effort felt distant, as though the decision had to travel farther than usual before reaching his body. The band reached his stomach. It paused. The hum returned, stronger this time. Pressure filled his ears and spread through his chest. Not painful, but heavy enough that he could feel each breath against it. After several seconds, the light moved again. It crossed his ribs, then it stopped over his chest. The shimmer distorted the blanket and the edge of his hands. He stared at the ceiling, afraid to look directly down at the band resting across him. The hum deepened. For one brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold still. Then the light vanished. The pressure ended. The bedroom returned to darkness. There was no fading glow on the wall, no sound outside the window, no vehicle moving away through the street. Only the clock beside the bed. 5:12 a.m. Nothing has happened in the 3 weeks since. The shoes remain hidden. The furniture has been moved more than once. Every part of the window has been checked for reflections. The room has stayed ordinary, but most mornings, a minute or two before 5:12, the man still wakes without an alarm. He lies there in the dark. He watches the wall, and he waits to see whether the thin band of light will begin moving again. 15 ordinary nights, 15 people who were not searching for answers, yet found themselves standing inside moments that refused to behave like the world they knew. The details changed from one encounter to another, but the quiet pattern remained. Sound falling away, pressure gathering inside the ears, something passing close, then the return. The wind moved again. The machines restarted. The water rippled. The road became empty. Everything was placed back so carefully that only a clock, a camera, or a witness's memory suggested anything had happened at all. Perhaps you are still listening closely. Perhaps the names and places have already begun to soften as you drift towards sleep. Both are welcome here. And sometime, on a quiet night of your own, you may notice how much sound the world usually makes. The distant traffic, the movement of air, a house settling around you. Sometimes it is only when those sounds disappear that we realize they were there. For now, let the night return to normal. Rest well,